Well, hello everyone. Today it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Gaurav Baruah. Dr. Baruah did his BSMS in biology at IISER Kolkata, and after that he went off for a PhD at the University of Zurich, uh, he's been working on mostly eco-evolutionary dynamics models using publicly available data sets. So he does theory, but always in connection to empirical data, which I think is very nice. And most recently, he's been a postdoc at the University of Bielefeld, and I'm sure he's going to tell us about some of the great work he's been doing at all of these places. Gaurav, you
All
can.
right. Yes. Thank you, Aaron, for inviting me to give this talk. I don't know what the background of everyone here is, but I'm gonna make it very general. And if you guys like the talk, or you can contact me for references, and I can direct you there. So today, mostly, I'm going to talk about eco-evolutionary dynamics of ecological networks, and specifically talk about the variation that you observe in species and what the implications of such individual variation. So whenever we talk about ecological networks, one of the simplest ecological network is, for instance, here is a tritrophic food chain. So for instance, here the plant, which is Vicia fava or um, pea plant, is basically a pest. This is the aphid. It's an insect, which basically is a pest for this particular plant, which basically is a herbivore, basically. And this herbivore is normally is being consumed by a ladybird, which is the predator. So this is the simplest kind of one of the simplest ecological network. But ecological networks can be as simple as a tritrophic food chain to as complex as a 147 species plant pollinator network. And this is an empirical plant pollinator network that was observed and collected in Peru, South America, where these orange nodes are basically the plants, and the blue nodes are basically the pollinators. And the size of each of this node, and each node is basically a species here, and the size of each of these nodes represents how many unique interactions it's engaging in. For instance, this node or these two species, you can call it as a hyper or super generalist. Or there are quite a few hyper or super generalist species in such a network. But when you look at this complex plant pollinator network or ecological network, there are several problems from the ecological side of things. Particularly, because it's a large network, it's very difficult to track empirically over time. Sorry, I have a cat. Okay, so she might jump, and she's awake, kind of. So it's very difficult to empirically track this 147 species over time, right? How can you track each species, let's say, almost every year or something, So it's very difficult from empirical side of things. And because it's very difficult to track such species over time, we have very sparse data, and which unlike other fields, it's very different. Like if you want to model such a community, such a network, it becomes increasingly difficult because you do not have information of what's going on. So you basically uh, have very sparse data to parameterize the model. In addition, there could be other things that could be also um, that could also make it difficult. For instance, this is a food web of 181 species. Let's say it's found in Wisconsin. It's a lake food web where you see, for instance, this is the lowest trophic. This is the basal resource, algae, so there's like a 4 trophic food web. It's a 181 species food web. And the problem here is that what if this particular network, obviously this is just an example, what if this particular network is embedded such a network of food webs? Now it's no more just two interactions, it's a myriad different types of interactions both positive, for instance, plants and pollinators, also here negative interactions. So it could be a part of a wider network, which then becomes infinitely difficult to understand and to model. However, researchers or ecologists or theoretical ecologists have are able to model this, and uh, mostly the ecological from the ecological side of things. What I mean by that is like you might have seen these equations. These are basically known as Rosen-Weig-MacArthur equations. So it's a type of Lotka-Volterra type equations instead of in the Lotka-Volterra equations, where you do not have this type 2 functional curves, where if you put h equal to 0, this becomes linear, which is similar to Lotka-Volterra. But this is a Rosen-Weig-MacArthur model, which very well kind of fits how predator-prey dynamics occurs. So you have a different type of different type of functional response curve, as it's called. So the N here is basically the basal resource species, and the C is basically the consumers. So basically, the consumers here could be the zooplankton, insects, and fishes. So what the parameters here denote is BI is basically the intrinsic growth rate. These are the competition coefficients. AIJ, let's say this LG competing with it with each other, and this is basically the across trophic levels, which is captured by this particular adjacency matrix of feeding interactions. Right. But again, when you look at this particular figure, this is only ecological dynamics. And also the other aspect of such dynamics is that this AIK or alphas are fixed. They do not change over time. So it's a snapshot. So basically you go into the field, you see who interacts with whom, and that's it. Because you cannot track each of these individual species over time, then it becomes value. So you basically take a snapshot, and based on that, you basically model the system. Similarly, for a plant pollinator bipartite network, for instance, of pollinators and plants, these are the type of equations that are normally used to model the ecological dynamics of plants and, for instance, animals or pollinators here, where R's are the growth rates, S and JK are basically similarly the inter and intra-specific computation coefficients, and this is basically the positive interactions or the mutual network, where it's again a type 2 functional curve given by this, where BJI basically captures how a pollinator interacts with a plant. Again, similarly here, these coefficients, as you see, are fixed. They do not change over time. So of course, these equations are, in a way, can tell us can give us a picture of how such networks can respond over time, but it doesn't give us a complete picture. Interactions, for instance, here between species are considered static. That means that they do not change over time. And as in addition, there's no direct environmental impact in this way. In such models, you basically assume this RI or RGs are somehow related to some kind of. So basically, no evolutionary dynamics or no changes in interaction strings. So this is what I'm trying to do, or what we are trying to do here, is that eco-evolutionary dynamics, how ecological dynamics, that is the dynamics of populations, can feed on evolutionary dynamics or changes in phenotypic dynamics, and how this phenotypic dynamics then feeds back on ecological dynamics. And so this kind of framework is currently lacking. And when you look at eco-evolutionary dynamics of such networks, now interactions between species, for instance, this particular plant and this pollinator, or this plant and these pollinators, are mediated by what we know as species traits. Now, what are traits? I'll get to it in a bit. So now species traits that the phenotypes that species possesses can change dynamically. And if they change dynamically, then the interaction strengths or interaction coefficients are no more static, but they become very dynamic in nature. For instance, let's take this again, plant pollinated network. So these are different hummingbird species, and you can see the phenotypes of these beak depth are, or morphology of these beaks are very different. And this is very much associated with which kind of plant they can pollinate it. For instance, as you can see, this particular corolla, it's a kind of bent, and it is particularly suitable for this particular hummingbird, which is a bent beak. Uh, yeah. So we see that species such as this hummingbird, which is a pollinator, exhibit a variation in such traits. So some might have a slightly longer or smaller. We see a lot of variation. And how does this variation can manifest in the interactions between species in such a network? And how does that feedback on the dynamics of these ecological networks in a whole is something that we are trying to model. So how do we do that? So before we go to that, what we do is, like, typically what I do is that we look at empirical plant pollinator network. For instance, here it's a let's say we take 101 empirical plant pollinator networks from just a second, from a Web of Life database, and this database consists of these are basically the coordinates of where the networks have been collected, and there are multiple networks in multiple sites, and basically these 101 networks that we collected distributed globally. That's what we are trying to say. And then number of species range for as low as 8 species to as high as 147 species, okay? So with varying topology. So how do we model um, eco-evolutionary dynamics? So what we do is typically in such models is reconcile or combine quantitative genetics. So quantitative genetics is a branch of population genetics, which deals with, let's say, quantitative traits or continuous traits. Now, what are continuous traits? Continuous traits are, for instance, body size or height of humans, where you have a continuous distribution. And it's not discrete like your blood type, right? So it's a continuous trait where individuals show a continuous variation in such traits, and it's usually follows a normal distribution. So that branch of population genetics is known as quantitative genetics, which deals with such quantitative continuous traits. So what we do is basically we reconcile this framework of quantitative genetics or field of quantitative genetics with dynamical equations that I've shown just earlier. So how do we do that? Let's take this particular example of plant pollinator network. So let's take this particular pollinator pollinating a bunch of other plant species. Okay, so let's assume that let's just focus on this particular pollinator, and individual belonging to this particular pollinator, let's term it as Z, or the phenotype is Z, the growth rate or per capita growth rate of and phenotype belonging to this pollinator can be modeled by this particular equations. I'm not going to go into the details of this. You can, if you want to talk to me about it later, or you can look at some references, okay? So the phenotype, the growth rate of a phenotype that belonging to this pollinator can be given by this. So B is basically the rate of growth independent of this phenotype. And this basically captures the competition that this phenotype faces from other pollinators. And this term is basically the mutualistic interest. So basically, how well this particular phenotype is able to, how similar it is to a plant phenotype. What I mean by this is, for instance, this particular hummingbird, which has, let's say, big depth of some um, 5 or 6 centimeter, for instance, will not have a successful mutualistic interaction with this particular um, uh, plant phenotype because it is bent, and that's why it's very difficult. There will be some kind of beneficial, but the interaction strength should be low. However, this particular phenotype, if it is able to interact, or if it is, because it matches with the plant phenotype, which is the corolla depth of this flower, because they're matching, they would have a higher successful mutualistic benefit from such an interactions. And this is given by what we typically call a Gaussian interaction curve, which is basically is a Gaussian, simple Gaussian. So Z is basically a phenotype of a pollinator, Z dash is basically a phenotype of a plant individual. And this is basically embedded in empirical data where it has been consistently shown across different types of species. For instance, this butterfly proboscis, which is, you have this long proboscis, which should match with the depth of this flower for in order to a successful mutualistic interactions, or this hummingbird beak, or for instance, the proboscis of this particular moth. If it is not, if they do not match, they will have, let's say, a less successful interactions, or the benefits would be low. So now individuals of this species show wide variation in such traits. So basically, individuals will have a longer depth, smaller beak depth, and smaller different there could be a lot of morphological variation in such depths of the beak or the corolla length of these plants. And we want to understand how this variation that in individuals belonging to species, how does that impact the ecological network as a whole? Basically, that the dynamical aspects of ecological network, such as resilience, feasibility, collapse, and whatnot. Okay, so this is what we are going to look at. So we basically now what we do is the model population dynamics. So basically, you integrate over whole the trait space of a particular phenotype, and this gives you the population dynamics. And before, earlier ecologists only looked at this ecological dynamics. Now what we are doing is that we also look at the dynamics of the phenotypes, of the mean phenotype, where hi square is basically the heritage. So basically how similar your offsprings are to your parental generation. So if hi is, let's say, 1, you are very similar, for instance. And this is basically the trait dynamics. Okay. Yeah, so these are the populations, and so basically the ecological dynamics and basically evolutionary of phenotypic dynamics. Okay. Now we model that, and we models such networks over time, and then we try to understand feasibility. If you have questions, you can either ask me now, or you can also ask me. What do you guys prefer? Do you want to ask me now, or you want to ask it later at the end?
It's up to you. What do you prefer?
Maybe at the end, because then I'm at the flow and just I do
Sounds
it
good.
and okay. Uh, so yeah, so what we do first is the feasibility. Let's So basically what we do is that we model the eco-evolutionary dynamics, we simulate eco-evolutionary dynamics of such network, and then try to understand the coexistence, for instance. So here on the y-axis is the rho, which is basically a parameter which captures the strength of species competition, basically competition within a guild. And on the x-axis is the average mutualistic strength, which captures the across guild. So 0 means low, 6 means high. Again, 4 means low, 8 means high. And this is for this particular network. And feasibility of 1 would mean all the species in such a network has a positive abundance. And 0.25 means only 25% of the species have positive abundance at equilibrium. And this is for high individual variation, and this is for low individual. What I mean by low individual variation is when there is the variation within species in such traits is very low. So what we find is that you see a lot of parameter space where the feasibility is very low. However, when there is high individual variation, this parameter space extends in a way that it says that when there is variation within species in such networks, the feasibility domain or the feasibility increases. That means there are more coexistence. Now, such ecological networks, such as this particular one, are very nested. What I mean by nested. Now, if you can graph this particular plant bipartite network in terms of a matrix, where the rows basically denote pollinators, or sorry, the plants, and the columns denote the pollinators, then the structure of such an interaction matrix will look like this. So you'll see like Three of these species, as denoted by blue, enjoy a disproportionate number of interactions, and a lot of them have a very, very, very few interactions. So in nature, a lot of these bipartite networks have shown or exhibit such a characteristic property, which is nestedness. You can see there are a lot of a few hypergeneralists, and a lot of specialists. So ecologists, both theoreticians and empirical ecologists, have debated like why do we observe such a nested structure in nature? Some say it's because of seasonality in nature, or some say it's because it helps maintain biodiversity. But in all of these studies that have been done till date, one aspect of one aspect has always been ignored, which is the evolutionary dynamics or dynamics of species traits that can feedback on population. So that has always been ignored, and this is what we do. And we try to understand from an eco-evolutionary perspective. So we basically model such systems where we have both ecological dynamics and evolutionary dynamics, and then try to understand how does nestedness impact the dynamics of such networks. Okay, so on the y-axis here is the dominant eigenvalue. Maybe you guys know what dominant eigenvalue is. So the short answer is that this dominant eigenvalue captures the stability of such networks at equilibrium. Okay, so more negative the value is, the more stable a network is, and less negative a value is, the less stable a network is. And on the x-axis is the nestedness property of networks. 0.2 means they are less nested, and if it's 0.2, a network would look like something like this. Okay, and a highly nested network would look something like this. So where you see that there's 2-3 species which enjoy all the interactions, and a lot of other species enjoy 1 or 2 interactions. So what we found is that when there is no evolutionary dynamics, where the heritability is 0, that means that species, there is no evolutionary dynamics per se. What we observe is that although all networks that we analyze were stable at equilibrium, but we see a slightly positive slope or relationship. That means networks such that look like this, for instance, this one, are less stable compared to a network that is less nested. But when evolutionary dynamics are at play, when evolutionary dynamics are at play, which are basically the the violet colors and the orange colors, the relationship becomes inverted in a way that now this network becomes extremely stable. However, networks like such this are become less stable. So basically, these same networks, when there is evolutionary dynamics at play, becomes much, much, much stable. So what we observe in nature, such as this structure or structure like this, is basically the product of evolutionary dynamics that feeds back on ecological dynamics and increases the stability. We might we might see such a structure in nature because it it promotes stability. Right. Till now, what we have discussed is, or shown here are, so am I allowed? Okay, no worries. I will try to finish quick. So till now, what I've talked about is basically the coexistence, stability. What about collapse? What about extinction? What about complete collapse of such ecological networks? So feasibility, coexistence, stability is one side of the spectrum. What about the collapse? So what we do is that we try to simulate the collapse of such networks. Okay. So how do we do that? We basically this third term, which captures the interactions of positive interactions, we basically try to make it 0 by decreasing mutualistic interaction between species. So on the y-axis is the equilibrium biomass or abundance, and the x-axis is the mutualistic strength. Okay. So gamma naught at 6 would mean that the environmental conditions are really good, and 0 here would mean the environmental conditions are really poor. Okay. And on a y-axis is basically the equilibrium biomass of entire networks. So what we observe is that as the environmental conditions deteriorate from 6, let's say, where the environmental conditions are really good, to 4, you see that each point is an equilibrium biomass or abundance of a network. So as the environment deteriorates, they collapse. And both when such networks have low individual variation denoted by blue dots versus when the orange dots, they collapse around similar environmental conditions. Okay. What we also observe is that when networks have high individual variation, we see a lot of abruptness in such a collapse. There's an abruptness in the collapse. So basically, there is a jump from high abundance to sudden collapses. But when they show low variation, we see low amount of collapses. And we also see that a large number of species in such networks, when they have high variation, they exhibit sudden collapses compared to when low. So what we observed previously is that individual variation promotes feasibility and stability in such networks on one hand, but on the other hand, it also promotes sudden collapses. So what is happening is there higher phenotypic variation in such bipartite mutualistic networks promotes higher mutualistic variation. So if you have higher variation, you are able to pollinate a lot of different plants, and this leads to higher mutualistic benefits, higher biomass. Higher mutualistic benefits means higher positive benefits, higher fitness. Higher fitness leads to higher biomass. Higher biomass leads to higher biomass load in poor conditions, and then once you slightly change the environment, it abruptly collapses. That's what's happening. So basically, individual variation is basically a double-edged sword, where it in some cases increases feasibility, that means coexistence. But on the other hand, individual variation could also lead to abrupt, sudden collapses. How
Are you asking about the time?
much time do I have? Like, is
Uh,
it is
there
there
is
a
no
time limit?
length for this. You can go as long as you want. There's no problem.
Right. Okay. 10 minutes should be done. Right. Now, once such systems have collapsed, what happens? What should we do? What happens to systems that go beyond collapse? So once it has collapsed, what should we do about it? So, for instance, as the environmental stress increases, the systems collapse, as you can see it around this. And now, once it collapses, what should we do? A graphical way to observe this particular problem is this. So let's say on the x-axis is some kind of an environmental parameter, which could be, let's say, habitat loss or some species loss in a network. And on the y-axis is the state, for instance, a richness of the community or the biomass of the community. As the environmental parameter, which could be a habitat loss or anything, for instance, as it deteriorates from right to left, the system which is at, let's say, a high biomass, high richness state, for instance, here around this position, it transitions to this blue space, which is, let's say, low biomass, low richness state. Now, the naive way to think about recovering such a network is to basically restore the environmental conditions. So basically restore the habitat. While it can be possible, more often than not, what happens is that the system doesn't recover, doesn't go back to the state and remains in this state. And if that happens, what what we observe is what is known as hysteresis, where the recovery part is not the same as the collapse part. And this is what is known as hysteresis. And if hysteresis is present in such systems, recovery can become extremely difficult. And in addition, how do we, for instance, restore environmental conditions? For instance, how do we reverse if warming, for instance, if there is warming is happening, how do we reverse? So once a system collapses, how do we revive it? Under what conditions is possible? Is it even possible? So again, we took a similar modeling framework where we have this, again, eco-evolutionary framework, and then model population dynamics and trade dynamics, and first then evaluated a collapse regime. So the collapse of such 147. So when it collapses, and then we see whether we observe hysteresis on. So for this 147 species plant pollinating network, again, on the x-axis is the mutualistic strength. or the environmental conditions. 4 would mean very good environmental conditions, 0 would mean very poor environmental conditions. And richness is obviously the richness of equilibrium richness of this network at each of these points. Okay. So what we observe is that as environmental conditions deteriorate from very good to poor, you see there is a sudden jump from high richness state to a low collapse state. Now, once it collapses, what we do is that we restore the environmental conditions. So basically, we start from these conditions. We start where the richness is at 0, and what we do is we change the environmental, which we make the environmental conditions better. So we start at this scenario, and then we go towards this direction. And when we do is that what we observe is that even when you restore the environmental conditions, we do not see a complete recovery. So even at the very good environmental conditions, even if you restore the environmental conditions to exactly what it was before, we do not see a recovery. So this is basically what is known as hysteresis. So hysteresis is very much found in such plant pollinator networks. So when we have hysteresis, it becomes extremely difficult if a system collapses. And so how do we now how do we now revive a system that is at this state? How do we even think about it? So what we do here, we do a different kind of approach. Let's take this 45 species plant pollinator empirical network. We initialize this network that all species in this network has a very, very, very low density of 0.001. All of this starting density is very low. And gamma naught, which is basically the environmental conditions, lies between these two parameters, which also signifies that the environmental conditions is very low. Now, what we do is that we choose a species in such a network, let's say, based on betweenness centrality, which you might know from graph theory if you have taken basically, or degree centrality, and there are a bunch of other network measures that you can basically compute. So basically what we do is that we take here specifically we take a pick a species with high degree centrality, which is this one, and then what we do is repeatedly force this particular species with a forcing strength for a certain duration. So what this means is basically you increase the the species for a certain duration time, or you pump in individuals of this particular species for a certain time. However, the rest of the species remains as it is, so remains at low density. We do not perturb the rest of the system, but only this. And then we see whether we can come. So now, when gamma naught, when the environmental conditions are really poor, if you start the system at, we start this, initialize all the species at very high density, the system collapses. You see all the population density of all the species going to almost 0. If you do not do anything, it will remain there. Now, what we do next is that we pick this species or a couple of species, if you want. Let's say we take this particular species and we repeatedly perturb. So we start at this system, we repeatedly perturb only this particular species, and the rest of the species we do not perturb. And what we observe is that for a certain duration time, you repeatedly perturb, and then boom, you see a recovery. And why is this happening? So what is happening is that this hypergeneralist species, which is the highest degree centrality, acts as a hub species to spread the perturbation. So this is because as species densities increase, so as the species densities increase, trait evolution then drives the rest of the recovery process. And this is only possible because such bipartite pollinator networks have a positive feedback loop. That means if you increase the density of this increase in density will help this particular species, increase in density will help, and it basically spreads like a wildfire. Now let's look at low trait variation and high trait variation. When you have low trait variation, when the species have initialized with low trait, you do not see a recovery. However, when you have high trait variation, you see a recovery if you perturb only this particular species, and the rest of the species are not perturbed. Right. So to summarize, such networks exhibit hysteresis. However, once such networks collapse, we can have species-specific perturbation, which can help the recovery of such networks. And this is possible in the presence of eco-evolutionary feedbacks, and trait variation does helps in the recovery process. So I would like to acknowledge all this funding agencies, DFG, SNF, ERC, Fortune's Credit, that has funded my research over time, and all these lovely people which has helped me in the research.